Now let's delve into how these companies make money. I'll use Northrop Grumman's income statement as an example. This information comes from their annual report, something they're required to publish yearly. None of it's proprietary. First, let's relate company sales, profit, and revenue to the typical contract structure. So in 2013, Northrop Grumman had $24,661,000,000 in net sales. That broke down into $5,379,000,000 of gross profit and $19,282,000,000 of operating expenses. Of the net sales, $21,278,000,000 was U.S. government contracts, 3.3 or almost 3.4 billion was either commercial or foreign sales, and almost 13 billion was accounted for with cost plus contracts. 11.662 billion was for fixed price contracts. In a firm fixed price contract structure, the profit earned contributes to gross profits. Likewise, in a cost plus contract structure, the profit or fee also contributes to gross profits. The cost on a firm fixed price contract is what contributes to operating expenses, and likewise on a cost plus contract, those costs are accounted for as operating expenses. So, as I said, Northrop Grumman had 24.6 billion in net sales, almost 5.4 billion in gross profit, and about 3 billion in operating expenses. Let's delve into gross profit. Of the 5,379,000,000 of gross profits, 2.256 billion were general and administrative expenses at the corporate level, and these were paid out of profits. So these were depreciation and amortization, executive compensation, pension expense, rent, and other things. The remaining profit is called operating income, and it was 3.123 billion. That breaks down into 2.863 billion in income before taxes. Northrop Grumman paid 257 million in interest and had 3 billion of other expenses. The net income was 1.952 billion. There was 13 million of extraordinary items, and what these are non-recurring events like the sale of a company or some other expense that is not expected to recur. It's reported this way so investors know that these are not recurring expenses or recurring income. And Northrop Grumman paid 911 million in income taxes. There was also a pension adjustment in 2013 that added 1.79 billion to Northrop Grumman's profit. In the prior 2 years, this adjustment accounted for a loss against profits. So the net income was 1.965 billion. The pension adjustment was 1.79 billion. That equated to a comprehensive income of 3.755 billion. Now, on typical cost plus contracts, especially if they're big ones, the potential fee is usually set at 15%. If a company is a second-tier supplier, it's lower, typically 13% or maybe 12%. But let's assume that the target fee on contracts like Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin holds is 15%. In a portfolio of programs, the actual fee earned is going to tend to be about half that. If a company does well on all their contracts, they could earn 50% across the board. But typically, they have some that do well, some that don't do well, and they earn about half. If you account for all the corporate expenses of the original 15% target fee, these companies are earning only about 2.65% profit on these contracts. Now, it's not to say that this is a hardship. These companies are very profitable. They do very well. But you should know that of the fee awarded, only about half that is actually getting reported as profits. On a firm fixed price contract, it's different. If they keep expenses low, they'll earn a profit, and that too contributes to net income. So that sums it up for shareholder value. So who runs these companies? The big three are run by Boeing is James McNerney. He's the chairman and chief executive officer, so he holds two of the titles that I described. Lockheed Martin is run by Marilyn Hewison. She's the chairman, president, and chief executive officer. And Northrop Grumman is run by Wes Bush, who's the chairman, chief executive officer, and president. Number of employees in these companies. Boeing has about 160,000. United Technology is well over 200,000. Lockheed Martin over 100,000. And then GD, Northrop Grumman is around 60 or 70,000, as is Raytheon. So quite a few employees in each of these large companies. All right, so next I want to break down the revenue that a company earns. And that starts with net sales. Again, net sales is broken down into gross profit, but I want to talk about the cost of revenue. And actually, instead of cost of revenue, we'll refer to the red line as operating expenses. So the fundamental expense these companies incur is labor. And labor is comprised of program management, systems engineering, people who build the spacecraft bus, people who build and design the payload, and then assembly and test. On top of labor is payroll expense. Payroll expense is composed of payroll taxes, group insurance, some pension contribution, 401 savings contributions, funding for vacation, holiday, sick leave. Some companies do pay an employee bonus, not all do, and then there's other expenses. On top of payroll expenses is overhead. And overhead is comprised of office space, some depreciation, human resources, facilities, training, and functional management. There are other direct costs on contracts. Likewise, there's procurement costs. There are subcontracts. And then on top of that is general and administrative costs. Now, these are separate from the corporate level general and administrative costs. G&A costs include internal research and development funding, bid and proposal funding, corporate expenses, insurance, legal. The corporate expense is a contribution to corporate that each of these sectors has to pay. And then director level bonuses come out of G&A. So internal research and development is funding that the government allows to be charged to contracts that companies can use at their discretion to develop new technologies that would potentially benefit the government. The government has to approve internal research and development, but approval is usually pretty tacit. Bid and proposal is funding that the government can include in G&A that companies use to write competitive proposals to win new business. And they're allowed to bill this as part of their G&A rate structure. And then what's last is material. This is the cost of raw material used to build, in our case, satellites. And then on top of that, which I said is separate, is fee and profit, and that equates with gross profit on the income statement. Subcontractors will also have their own rate structures. So you'll see little mini rate structures within subcontractors. And in this case, general and administrative costs are applied to subcontracts as well as to labor. So if you look at the breakdown of labor, typically 6 to 18% of the labor on a program is assembly and test. 18 to 30% is spacecraft bus design. 35 to 58% is payload design. 5 to 15% is system engineering, and 4 to 7% is program management. That equates for all the labor expense on a program. And let's say that this labor accounts for 100%. We then add a payroll expense, which is typically about 40%. That takes those raw labor costs and multiplies them by 1.4. Overhead typically had been 80%. Overhead rates have been coming down recently, but assume 80%. That takes the raw labor costs, which were multiplied by 1.4 for payroll expense, and now multiplies them by 2.52. A typical G&A is 18%. That now takes labor and multiplies it by 2.97. If you add a 7% fee, labor is now multiplied by 3.18. This is why when you look at salaries and equate it with the cost incurred on a contract, there's a pretty big multiplier. And in reality, you've got to pay payroll expense to keep employees employed. You've got to have overhead to support employees and programs, and you've got to have G&A to support the company. So these costs are required. If you look at the actual assembly and test costs, the real touch labor on these programs, it's about 1.8 to 5.6% of rolled up costs. So what this says is we're in a very overhead intensive business, both in terms of the raw labor, which needs program management and system engineering, as well as the other overhead expenses that are applied along the way. In subcontracts, they will have their own escalation, and the multiplier may not be 3.18%, but for comparative purposes, let's assume it's 3.18 as a multiplier. A prime would then apply their G&A, which makes the subcontractor's multiplier 3.75, and they apply their fee. The fee is spread over the entire base of the contract. So the multiplier for a subcontract is about 4. This is why companies only subcontract if the subcontractor provides some value that the prime contractor can't provide. Otherwise, it would be less expensive for the prime contractor to provide that good or service that would otherwise be subcontracted. All right, a different rate structure which has no G&A applied to subcontracts would reduce the net cost of subcontracts. Now there's only a 3.18 multiplier. But in order to do that, the contractor is going to have to increase their G&A expenses. So even though G&A is not applied to subcontracts in this case, the prime contractor typically is going to have very similar G&A expenses, which just means a higher G&A rate is applied to labor. And so now the labor multiplier goes up to 3.15, and at the top level is 3.37. And neither of these rate structures one isn't better over the other. They're just different. And here, the subcontractor labor escalation is now 3.4. So programs typically go in life cycles like this. In order to sustain a steady business, companies need a portfolio of programs with a few starting, a few in the middle, and a few finishing. Otherwise, they'd have trouble retaining employees. So this graph on the bottom is an attempt to depict a typical program profile. Companies have to estimate rates that go out 5 to 7 years. If they're going to plan existing projects and bid on proposals, they need to have both labor rates as well as overhead and G&A rates estimated. Otherwise, you couldn't predict future costs. A change in overhead and G&A affects everything in the rate pool. If you're a program manager who is on target, a rate increase could cause your program to overrun if the rate increase went up. If you're a proposal manager trying to compete, high rates can make you more expensive than your competitor. So these rates are managed very carefully, and they're reassessed continuously. So let's say we had a portfolio of programs within a company, project A through F. They were staffed by a number of functional areas, and these are typical functional areas. And let's say that we had a program cancellation. All the labor on that program would immediately charge to overhead if they don't have a project to charge to. Now, what a company will try to do is reallocate those people to project A through E, but let's say hypothetically they couldn't. So all those people would charge directly to overhead. In this rate structure, what that would do is it would take people that were originally charging to labor and actually earning overhead and G&A. It would move them out of the base labor pool, which would increase overhead by 90%, and G&A it would increase to 20% because the labor base is decreased. And it actually would move all those employees' labor charges into overhead, which increases overhead now to 100%. G&A ironically goes down because the overhead is part of the base for G&A. But this company, by losing that program, has now seen a significant increase in overhead, which they can't withstand. And what they will do is they will lay those people off if they can't find project work for them. That increases overhead to 90%, but overhead rates are still higher than they were. It increases G&A to 19.5%. And so these companies will find an additional 10% of overhead they can lay off and lay that off to bring their rates back down to where they were. And they have to do this in order to maintain cost performance on programs and in order to stay competitive. So something else companies do is try to grow their business. A program profile like this actually would mean a company would have to lay off people when this curve dipped. What they try to do is sustain it, but even better, what they try to do is grow the business. Companies follow a fairly consistent process in pursuing new business. If the government funds early studies and starts to conceive a program, companies will hold an interest gate, and here they'll decide whether to spend marketing funds, which are paid for out of overhead, to pursue this opportunity. If the government program matures into a Phase A study, companies will hold a pursue gate, and here they will assess whether the program is going to actually get funded by the government. That's the P-go, the odds that an opportunity will be funded, and a P-win, which is the company's own assessment of their probability of winning. They allocate funding based on the product of the P-go times the P-win. An opportunity that has a higher product of P-go times P-win will get more funding than an opportunity that has lower P-go times P-win. So if they pass the pursue gate, they will fund a capture phase. And there's pretty significant funding allocated to phases like this. This is typically paid out of IR&D funding and could be paid out of overhead. If the program matures into a Phase B study, companies continue in the capture phase, but when an RFP is released, companies will hold a bid-no-bid review. And here, they're determining whether they're going to fund a proposal effort which is paid for out of B&P. If they do decide to write a proposal and spend B&P to do that, they will submit the proposal, the government evaluates, they do a source selection. If the company wins, they negotiate. Negotiations are also paid for out of B&P, although it's pretty minimal. And if awarded, the company will now execute the program. And here they're incurring direct costs and can charge the government directly for the work they do. As I mentioned before, overhead is paid out of overhead, IR&D is paid out of general and administrative, B&P is paid out of G&A, and then direct is paid for directly out of the labor pool. If a company has contracts that aren't performing well and they lose all of their profit and fee, which happens, they're still able to bill overhead and they're still able to bill G&A, which means they have money to pay for marketing, they have money to pay for capture, and they have money to pay for proposals. So while contracts that don't earn a profit are bad, it's not all bad for these companies. When proposals are written, and it starts years ahead of time for those who are good at this, a company must plan the program in detail and estimate costs. So again, this is a typical profile. When a company writes a proposal, they would expect costs to be in line with a profile like this. While program costs do not fit a normal distribution, companies use this to assess risk. And what they're doing here is they're saying, if I bid this program very high, my odds of execution are going to be nearly 100%. If I'm more aggressive and I bid this lower, what the x-axis says is my odds of execution are going to be lower, which means I've got a risk that I might overrun. And if I get very aggressive, I'll bid this very, very low, but my odds of overrunning are going to be very, very high. Companies typically like to be in this 80% to 50% range. And again, this is an assessment they do, but lately, if they feel like they can't be competitive, and that a competitive bid would be too risky for them, they won't bid on the contract. So when proposals are written, costs are estimated, and then they're negotiated, and then they're allocated. The estimated proposed costs are higher. When contracts are negotiated, usually the target cost is reduced. And then when funds are allocated to performing organizations, program management will hold back funding so that they have a management reserve. So the person who wrote the original estimate will have estimated one value to do the work, and they have to do an estimate that they will sign up to, and it's got to be reasonable and ethical. But over time, what they estimated will be eroded, and they'll actually be expected to perform the work for less money than they had originally estimated. And it could be a 20 to 30% reduction. Everybody in these companies who performs work understands this. They know they're going to get challenged, and they don't necessarily pad their bid, but they make sure that one way or another, they find a way to do the work for the money that is allocated. So I mentioned that companies that earn no fee are able to fund IRAD and BNP and can actually fund new business. There's more to the impact of no fee as well, though. If a company's earning no fee, they still can bill for overhead, and that will pay for some of their labor. That'll pay for depreciation, office space. So they're able to cover these expenses. And likewise with G&A, they not only can fund BNP and IR&D, they're still able, ironically, to pay bonuses, corporate expenses, and labor allocated to G&A. So this is why sometimes on programs that are not earning any fee, you'll hear about people earning bonuses because they're paid for out of G&A, which the company is still able to bill for. All right, so now I want to talk about the corporate structure at lower levels. And these are the people on these contracts that we're typically dealing with directly. So it starts with the president and vice presidents who have responsibility for profit, loss, and sales. They have good insight into what drives shareholder value. These are people that probably hope to be the CEO someday, and if not, are interacting pretty closely with the CEO. But they're not accountable to shareholders directly. And they're kind of the buffer between shareholder value-driven motivations and employee-driven motivations at the lower level. At the next level is director and managers. They're really more focused with unit performance and group performance. These people can be incredibly busy, and they're really focused on doing their job. They have less insight into what drives shareholder value and less shareholder value motivations. And at the bottom are employees that are more focused on individual performance and may have some insight into what drives shareholder value, but not so much as the people on the top of the org chart. So the way these people are compensated can give you some insight into what motivates them. The people at the higher level earn bonus and a salary and usually get stock, and they're typically paid out of profits. So if profits increase, there's more money to compensate them. VPs also get a salary and a bonus and stock and are paid out of profit. Directors, however, they'll get a salary and a bonus. Their salary is usually paid for directly on contracts. The bonus is paid for out of G&A. So while they may have insight into what drives shareholder value, their compensation is not so much at risk based on things like profit and other metrics that shareholders value. Managers may possibly get a small bonus. Some companies do this, some don't. Their bonuses are also paid out of G&A, and employees may get a small bonus which will be paid out of G&A as well. So by and large, people at the bottom of the org chart, because they're not compensated based on things that drive shareholder value, tend not to have as much shareholder focus. And the bonuses that are paid at the higher level are usually based on how profitable the company is and how much they grow their sales and revenue. But at the lower level, compensation is typically more about employee retention than it is about rewarding performance based on shareholder metrics. That's why many of the people that we deal with really aren't motivated by what motivates people at the higher levels. So a takeaway. DIRECTV is a great case study that illustrates how shareholder value can drive decisions at the highest levels. So the original Hughes Electronics Corporation was owned by GM, and it was comprised of Hughes Communication Inc., an entity that acquired satellites and leased them. Hughes Space and Communications developed satellites. Hughes Electro-Optical developed payloads for satellites. Delco was the technology arm of GM. Hughes Network Systems had a satellite leasing business of their own, and then DIRECTV. And these are the major components of Hughes Electronics. Well, initially, Hughes Communications Inc. Had a lot of value for the company, and they spun it off and sold it to Pan Am Sat. So this was the beginning of the spin-offs of Hughes Electronics. And then, because DIRECTV was doing so well and was driving the stock price so significantly, the executives of Hughes Electronics decided they wanted Hughes Electronics to be more of a pure DIRECTV play, and they wanted to divest themselves of a pretty massive aerospace business. So they sold Hughes Space and Communications to Boeing. They sold Hughes Electro-Optical to Raytheon, and they gave Delco back to GM. This was tens of thousands of employees. The size of Hughes Electronics at the time as an aerospace company rivaled the biggest aerospace companies that we deal with today. It was formidable. It included both satellite manufacturing and payload manufacturing. But at the time, it made more sense to spin these off, and so they did spin them off. Later, Hughes Network Systems was spun off to EchoStar, and what remained of Hughes Electronics, the old Hughes Aircraft Company, was purely DIRECTV. And the reason behind this was because of DIRECTV's phenomenal growth. DIRECTV started in 1996, but at about 2005, they earned a profit. And you can see from this graph, the revenue lines, the blue lines, they added about $1 billion a year of revenue and even more later on. And profits, which is the scale on the right, increased significantly. So even though they had a crown jewel of an aerospace company, it made more sense for them to spin off those less profitable parts so that investors could enjoy the benefits of a pure play of a stock that was solely DIRECTV. So we would like to think that companies are customer-focused and employee-focused and less shareholder-focused. But in reality, given the significant drivers and given the fact that shareholders own these companies, they have to be shareholder-focused first, customer-focused second, and employee-focused third. Companies who are not shareholder-focused don't do well, their valuations decline, and they're ultimately going to get acquired by some entity that's going to put in new management who will be shareholder-focused. So even if you're a company who's not shareholder-focused, you will be someday. So this guy, our commander-in-chief and chief executive, favors capitalism. And as I said years ago, somebody made the decision to outsource much of the work that we do to the private sector. They build the complex satellite systems that we operate. Outsourcing, as I mentioned, helps bolster our capitalistic sector. And it was a decision that was made a while ago. I think that the relationship we have with corporate companies is extremely good, but hopefully this has given you some insight into why their motives are not always mission-focused as ours are.